Stretching thousands of miles across mountains, deserts, and vast plains, the Silk Road was far more than just a route for goods. It was a lifeline that wove together the fortunes of empires, the exchange of cultures, and the spread of ideas that shaped the world we know today. But what if the story you have always heard about this legendary trade network is only part of the truth? Beneath the allure of shimmering silk and exotic spices lies a darker, less glamorous reality, one filled with danger, greed, suffering, and secrets that have remained buried in the sands of time. Was the Silk Road truly the glittering beacon of prosperity that history often portrays, or is there a shadowed legacy hidden within its ancient pathways? In this video, we are about to pull back the curtain on 25 of these hidden truths, exposing the darker side of one of history's most famed trade routes. From the perils of banditry to the exploitation of laborers and the spread of deadly plagues, prepare to journey with us into the untold mysteries of the Silk Road. What you discover may forever change the way you view this iconic chapter of history. Stay with us as the hidden stories of the Silk Road are about to be unveiled. Now turning to the shadow of banditry, one of the most immediate and persistent dangers faced by those who dare to traverse the Silk Road. This extensive network of trade routes, stretching across vast and unguarded landscapes, was a haven for ruthless thieves and bandits. They lurked in the shadows of mountain passes, hid amongst the dunes of expansive deserts, and ambushed caravans in isolated stretches of wilderness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. These bandits were motivated by the immense value of the goods being transported: exquisite silks, rare spices, precious jewels, and other treasures, making traders an irresistible target. Caravans often became a battlefield as merchants and their hired guards fought to defend their cargo, knowing that failure could mean not only loss of fortune but also loss of life. Some regions along the Silk Road became especially infamous for their lawlessness. The desolate terrain of the Taklamakan Desert and the treacherous mountain passes of Central Asia were particularly notorious for harboring violent gangs of bandits. To survive these perilous journeys, savvy merchants equipped themselves with weapons, hired armed escorts, and banded together in large caravans for mutual protection. Yet, even the most well-prepared travelers could fall victim to the cunning strategies of bandits, who used deceit, ambush tactics, and sheer force to overpower their targets. This constant threat made every journey along the Silk Road a gamble, where fortune and ruin were separated by a fine line. With the next phase of the journey in sight, let us uncover an even darker and more unsettling reality: the thriving trade of human lives that was hidden beneath the surface of this legendary route. As the next challenge unfolds, we confront the grim reality of human trafficking along the Silk Road, a truth that casts a shadow over the romanticized tales of trade and cultural exchange. Beneath the bustling activity of merchants trading silk, spices, and other prized commodities, there existed a harrowing market for human lives. Men, women, and children were bought, sold, and transported as though they were mere cargo, their fates decided by the whims of the powerful. This trade in human lives was not limited to any one region but spanned the entire length of the Silk Road, with victims sourced from conquered territories, impoverished villages, or captured during raids. Many were stripped from their communities, forced into lives of servitude, labor, or exploitation far from the lands they once called home. For some, their journey ended as servants in foreign courts or as laborers in perilous industries, while others were coerced into roles of even darker nature. The human cost of this trade cannot be overstated, as entire families were torn apart, and generations carried the scars of this exploitation. Beyond the individual tragedies, this system of human trafficking also wove itself into the fabric of societies along the route, perpetuating inequality and creating a stark divide between the powerful and the powerless. The profits reaped from this inhumane practice further fueled the Silk Road's economy, with human beings treated as just another commodity to be exchanged for wealth. It is a haunting reminder of the suffering tethered to the prosperity and splendor often celebrated in stories of this historic trade network. With this unsettling truth laid bare, let us move forward to uncover how the Silk Road became an unintentional yet potent vehicle for the spread of plague and disease. As the next chapter of this story unwinds, we confront an unsettling truth that showcases the unintended consequences of interconnected trade: the Silk Road as a carrier of the world's deadliest diseases. Among these, the infamous Black Death stands out, a catastrophic pandemic that reshaped history in ways still felt today. The Silk Road, bustling with merchants, animals, and goods, became an unwitting conduit for the spread of infectious diseases, including the plague. As caravans journeyed across vast distances, they carried not only precious items like silk and spices, but also invisible and deadly pathogens. Fleas, often residing on the backs of rats that scurried among the caravan supplies, acted as vectors for the plague bacteria, triggering outbreaks in towns and cities that hosted these traders. The very structure of the Silk Road, designed to connect distant civilizations, ironically became the perfect pathway for diseases to leap from one community to another, leaving devastation in their wake. The Black Death, which swept across Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa, claimed tens of millions of lives, destabilizing societies and economies along its path. Entire towns were wiped out, agricultural systems collapsed, and a haunting sense of fear took hold as people struggled to understand the source of this invisible menace. The ripples caused by this plague extended far beyond the immediate loss of life, leading to profound shifts in population dynamics, labor structures, and even cultural attitudes towards health and mortality. This tragic consequence highlights the darker side of the Silk Road's role in history, a network that connected civilizations but also exposed them to shared vulnerabilities. As we unravel this chilling aspect, our journey continues to reveal the underpinnings of exploitation as we explore the harsh realities faced by laborers who built and sustained the Silk Road's treacherous routes. With the next phase of the journey in sight, we uncover the harrowing reality of the laborers who toiled endlessly to construct and maintain the Silk Road's vast infrastructure. These workers, often drawn from the poorest strata of society, faced grueling conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. From carving treacherous mountain paths to laying foundations in scorching deserts, their labor was the backbone of this legendary trade route. Many were conscripted or forced into these roles by local rulers or empires, leaving them little choice but to endure the backbreaking work required to sustain the network. Days were filled with relentless physical toil, and nights often offered little in the way of rest or reprieve. Essential resources like food and water were sparse in the more remote regions, leading to malnutrition, exhaustion, and for many, death before their task was complete. The extreme temperatures along the route, freezing cold in the mountain ranges and searing heat in the deserts, added yet another layer of hardship. These conditions were not only physically devastating but also emotionally isolating, as many workers were separated from their families, living under the shadow of exploitation and despair. Yet, the fruits of their labor rarely benefited them directly. The wealth generated by the bustling trade along the Silk Road often funneled upward to merchants, aristocrats, and rulers, leaving the workers themselves in the same impoverished states they started from, or worse. Their sacrifices laid the groundwork for one of history's most celebrated trade networks, but their stories have largely been forgotten in favor of the goods and riches they helped transport. As this dark truth reveals the human cost behind the Silk Road's success, our exploration turns to yet another overlooked consequence: how the insatiable demand for resources negatively impacted the environment along this ancient trade route. Now turning to the environmental cost of the Silk Road, we unravel a devastating impact often overlooked in the narrative of trade and prosperity. The construction and sustained operation of such a colossal trade network demanded vast amounts of natural resources, leaving a lasting scar on the landscapes it traversed. Wood, for example, was heavily relied upon for building shelters, crafting tools, and fueling fires in desert regions where warmth and cooking were vital. Entire forests were cleared in some areas to meet these demands, triggering widespread deforestation that upset local ecosystems. The overuse of water resources was equally alarming. Caravans and settlements along the Silk Road required large quantities of water to sustain both people and livestock. In arid regions, this led to the depletion of already fragile water supplies, contributing to the drying up of vital springs and rivers. The unrelenting extraction of these resources did not allow the environment time to recover, setting the stage for further degradation. Moreover, as forests disappeared and water sources dwindled, desertification followed. Once fertile lands were transformed into barren wastelands, unable to support agriculture or sustain local populations. The very trade that brought wealth and connectivity to some regions left others struggling to survive amidst an increasingly hostile environment. These ecological consequences were not merely a temporary inconvenience, but rather set off a chain reaction that shaped the destiny of entire communities and landscapes for centuries. With nature itself burdened under the weight of this sprawling trade route, we now look deeper into another shadowy truth: the origins of the opium trade and its entanglement with this historic artery of commerce. As the next challenge unfolds, we uncover the early roots of the opium trade and its unsettling connection to the Silk Road. While the trade route is often celebrated for spreading valuable goods like silk, spices, and knowledge, it also facilitated the movement of substances that brought devastation. Among these, opium stands out as one of the most infamous. Cultivated from the poppy plant, opium was initially prized for its medicinal properties, offering pain relief and a sense of tranquility. However, its addictive nature quickly turned it into a commodity of both value and vice. Across the Silk Road, opium became a sought-after product, exchanged not only for goods but also as a tool of influence and control. Traders transported opium from regions like Central Asia to far-reaching markets in the Middle East, South Asia, and eventually as far as Europe and China. Its demand grew steadily, creating lucrative opportunities for merchants but leaving a trail of addiction and dependency. The Silk Road, with its vast network of routes, allowed opium to circulate widely, embedding it into the cultural and economic fabric of many societies. This early movement of opium set the stage for larger conflicts centuries later, including the notorious Opium Wars. These wars were fueled by the devastating societal impact of opium addiction, as imperial powers exploited its trade to gain economic and political dominance. Though the Silk Road itself had long diminished by that time, its role in establishing opium as a global commodity cannot be ignored. What began as a seemingly harmless trade item turned into a source of immense suffering, with consequences that would reverberate for generations. As we reflect on the potent and destructive reach of the opium trade, we now shift focus to examine another hidden layer of the Silk Road: the political instability that often threatened the very lifeline of this ancient network. With the next phase of the journey in sight, we delve into the tumultuous world of political instability that frequently cast a shadow over the Silk Road. While the network served as a vital artery for trade and cultural exchange, its success was precariously tied to the stability of the regions it traversed. The vast expanse of the Silk Road cut through countless territories and empires, each with its own rulers, armies, and agendas. This patchwork of authority often left the route vulnerable to disruptions caused by power struggles, invasions, and shifting alliances. Local wars and feuding factions frequently erupted, leading to blocked passages, looted caravans, and unsafe conditions for merchants. For instance, when empires like the Han Dynasty or the Roman Empire faltered, the ripple effect was felt across the Silk Road. Towns and cities that thrived on the trade revenue were plunged into economic crises as conflicts disrupted the flow of goods and travelers. Merchants, heavily reliant on the route for their livelihood, faced ruin as they were unable to navigate these treacherous landscapes. Some regions imposed heavy tariffs to fund war efforts, while others closed borders entirely to prevent the movement of rivals. Even prosperous trade hubs could fall victim to political turmoil as conquerors sought control over lucrative markets and key junctions. This constant instability didn't just endanger traders but also undermine the trust and cooperation required to sustain such a vast network. For those depending on the Silk Road for their prosperity, these disruptions were a stark reminder of how fragile this lifeline truly was. Amid the chaos of political upheaval, the Silk Road was both a blessing and a curse, offering unparalleled opportunities yet exposing its participants to the volatility of human greed and ambition. As we move forward, we uncover the secretive roles traders played beyond commerce, shedding light on their hidden involvement in espionage and intelligence, which added another layer of intrigue to this storied route. As the next challenge unfolds, we step into the shadowy realm of espionage that wove itself into the fabric of the Silk Road. Beyond the exchange of goods and ideas, this ancient trade route also carried secrets sometimes whispered in hushed tones, other times concealed in the folds of silk or buried among spices. Traders, often considered mere facilitators of commerce, frequently found themselves playing dual roles as spies for the powers that be. Rulers and empires recognized the strategic value of the Silk Road not just as a trade artery but as an intelligence-gathering goldmine. Merchants, with their access to far-flung regions and diverse cultures, were seen as ideal operatives. They were tasked with observing the strengths and weaknesses of foreign lands, assessing military capabilities, and uncovering political intentions during their travels. Some traders willingly cooperated, enticed by promises of wealth or protection, while others were coerced into becoming pawns in the games of rulers. The information they carried often shaped alliances, fueled rivalries, and even sparked conflicts. For example, the Han dynasty is believed to have used merchants to gather intelligence on nomadic tribes to safeguard their territories. Likewise, rival empires sought to infiltrate trade caravans, planting spies who would collect critical insights under the guise of commerce. This climate of mistrust added a layer of danger to an already perilous journey. Traders had to tread carefully, as being exposed as a spy could lead to imprisonment, torture, or death. Moreover, the constant suspicion between kingdoms and empires meant that even innocent merchants were sometimes accused of espionage, caught in the crossfire of political schemes. The dual roles traders played blurred the line between commerce and conflict, turning the Silk Road into not just a route of exchange but a battleground of secrets and strategy. As we unravel this web of intrigue, we now turn to another somber truth: the suppression of local identities and cultural erasure by dominant powers seeking control over this vital trade network. Now turning to the sobering reality of cultural erasure, we uncover yet another dark shadow cast by the Silk Road. While this legendary trade route is often celebrated for its role in promoting cultural exchange, the very powers that sought to control it frequently exploited their dominance to suppress or completely erase local identities. Empires and kingdoms vying for control over these lucrative trade networks often imposed their languages, traditions, and belief systems on the regions they occupied. This was not always a peaceful process. In many cases, cities, tribes, and communities along the Silk Road were forced to abandon their own customs to conform to the ruling power's agenda. For instance, dominant empires would mandate the use of their own language in trade and governance, or propagate their religions through coercion rather than voluntary conversion. Local art, music, and even clothing styles were replaced or diluted by the cultural preferences of those in power, leaving generations disconnected from their heritage. Over time, entire societies could find their traditions irreversibly altered or forgotten, buried under the weight of imposed ideologies. One striking example is the spread of imperial architecture along the route, where the towering halls and grandiose designs of ruling empires overshadowed local architectural styles, symbolizing dominance rather than coexistence. This deliberate imposition was often paired with the economic control exerted by those empires, favoring their own goods over locally crafted products, thereby stifling regional creativity and industries. While the Silk Road brought undeniable advancements and connections, it also served as a stage where cultural suppression played out, reshaping the identities of those who lived along its path. The legacy of this erasure is a poignant reminder of the cost borne by local cultures in the face of economic ambition and imperial power. With this heavy truth in mind, we now shift focus to another troubling aspect of the Silk Road: the role of forced religious conversions that further deepen the scars left by these dominating powers. As the next challenge unfolds, we uncover the troubling reality of forced religious conversions along the Silk Road, a shadowy aspect of its history that reveals how faith, like trade, could become a tool for domination. While the Silk Road is often idealized as a pathway for the peaceful spread of religious ideas, the truth is far more complex and at times deeply unsettling. Ruling powers and empires who sought control over these vital trade routes often wielded religion as a means of asserting authority, using coercion to enforce their beliefs on local populations. Entire communities were frequently given an impossible choice: convert or face persecution, displacement, or even death. In some cases, these conversions came with threats of violence, economic sanctions, or the destruction of cultural sites sacred to indigenous faiths. For instance, religious monuments like temples or shrines belonging to local traditions were demolished or replaced with structures that symbolized the ruling empire's dominant religion, erasing not only places of worship but also the spiritual heritage of countless people. It was not uncommon for traders and travelers, who were themselves often adherents of particular faiths, to become unwitting participants in this cycle, carrying the doctrines of conquering empires to further corners of the Silk Road. Violent conflicts between differing religions also erupted as competing beliefs clashed, leading to bloodshed and enduring divisions. This darker narrative underlines how the spread of religion along the Silk Road was not always about mutual understanding, but could instead deepen the scars of cultural and spiritual suppression. This somber truth reminds us that alongside the stories of connection and enlightenment, the Silk Road also bore the weight of imposed ideologies and forced spiritual transformation. With this unsettling history in mind, we turn next to a lesser-known but equally grim truth: the toll that the Silk Road exacted on the animals that carried humanity's ambitions along its vast and perilous stretches. As the next phase of the journey comes into focus, we confront a somber reality often overshadowed by tales of human struggle: the immense burden placed on animals that served as the backbone of Silk Road trade. Camels, horses, donkeys, and oxen were indispensable to the transportation of goods across the unforgiving terrains, yet their role in this historic network came at a steep cost. These animals were subjected to grueling conditions, forced to traverse thousands of miles through scorching deserts, treacherous mountain passes, and barren steppes with minimal rest or nourishment. Camels, often romanticized as the ships of the desert, endured endless days without water, carrying excessively heavy loads until exhaustion or injury rendered them useless. Horses, prized for their speed and endurance, were pushed to their physical limits, often collapsing under the weight of goods or succumbing to the extreme climates. In many cases, these animals were treated as expendable, discarded or replaced when they could no longer meet the relentless demands placed upon them. The cruelty extended beyond physical strain, as many were beaten or whipped in attempts to force them through challenging routes or increase their speed. These harsh conditions led to countless cases of suffering and death, with trails often littered with the remains of animals who did not survive the journey. Yet their sacrifices were largely unacknowledged, their suffering overshadowed by the human dramas of trade and conquest. The toll on these animals, though seldom discussed, forms a poignant chapter in the darker history of the Silk Road, a reminder of the hidden costs behind humanity's relentless pursuit of progress and prosperity. With this in mind, our exploration of the Silk Road's concealed truths now shifts to another unsettling aspect: the monopolies over luxury goods and the deep economic disparities they created. Now turning to the monopolies of luxury goods, we unveil another shadowy truth of the Silk Road. This vast network, celebrated for its exchange of culture and commerce, also became a catalyst for staggering economic inequalities. At the heart of this disparity were luxury items like silk, precious spices, rare gems, and fine porcelain goods so coveted that they could command unimaginable prices. The control over these commodities often fell into the hands of a select few powerful empires, affluent merchants, and influential trading guilds, creating monopolies that concentrated wealth in a way that left entire communities struggling to survive. Silk, for instance, was not just a fabric but a symbol of status and power. Ancient China, guarding the secrets of silk production with ruthless determination, ensured its monopoly for centuries. This exclusivity meant they could dictate its value and restrict access, keeping wealth flowing into their coffers while the rest of the world paid exorbitant prices. Similarly, spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, prized not only for flavoring food but also for medicinal and preservative purposes, were tightly controlled by traders who would go to great lengths to manipulate demand and inflate prices. The result of these monopolies was the stark enrichment of the few at the expense of many. Entire regions became dependent on these trade dynamics, and when faced with sudden shifts, whether from political upheaval, war, or the eventual discovery of alternative trade routes, they plunged into economic despair. Even among merchants, this disparity was evident. While some amassed fortunes and lived in opulence, countless others risked their lives traversing perilous routes only to scrape by, often losing everything to bandits, corrupt officials, or misfortune. This stratification didn't just affect commerce, it shaped societal structures, reinforcing hierarchies where wealth and privilege remained firmly out of reach for the majority. Through all this, the allure of luxury goods gave rise to an insidious cycle where the pursuit of trade wealth deepened economic divides and left a lasting legacy of inequality. As we leave behind the monopolies that drove these disparities, our journey next confronts another perilous chapter: the unrelenting threat of pirates targeting Silk Road trade routes both on land and at sea. As the next challenge unfolds, we delve into the shadowy waters of the Silk Road's maritime extensions, where a new menace loomed large: pirates. While the overland routes of the Silk Road are often romanticized, the sea routes were equally vital, connecting distant shores and transporting goods across vast oceans. Yet, these waters were anything but safe. Pirates prowled the maritime trade lanes like predators, lying in wait to ambush vulnerable ships carrying treasure troves of silk, spices, gold, and precious artifacts. These nautical raiders were not isolated outlaws, but often well-organized groups with intricate networks that rivaled the sophistication of the traders themselves. The South China Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean became notorious hotspots for piracy, with infamous pirate strongholds emerging along key coastal areas. For merchants, the threat was enormous. Ships represented significant investments laden with goods, crew, and hopes for fortune, but a single pirate attack could reduce these dreams to nothing. Beyond material losses, entire lives and livelihoods were at stake. Captured sailors were often enslaved, while some merchants faced brutal ransom demands that could bankrupt their families. The relentless attacks also took a toll on trade dynamics. Merchants were forced to pay exorbitant sums to hire private guards or join heavily defended convoys, which in turn drove up the cost of goods. For others, the risk was simply too great, causing certain trade routes to stagnate, redirect, or vanish entirely. Even governments struggled to contain the chaos. Naval forces from various empires attempted to patrol these waters, but many were either overpowered by the sheer cunning of the pirates or, in some cases, secretly colluded with them for a cut of the loot. This deadly game at sea wasn't confined to small-scale theft. Some pirate organizations grew so powerful that they became quasi-political entities, exacting their own taxes, establishing control over strategic ports, and even influencing regional economies. In this way, piracy along the Silk Road wasn't just a transient danger but a constant, evolving threat that reshaped maritime trade. With the next phase of the journey in sight, let us leave behind the treacherous seas and return to the land, where corruption among officials presented its own insidious challenges to travelers and traders alike. As the next challenge unfolds, we shift our attention to the shadows cast by corruption among local officials and border guards along the Silk Road. For traders, the journey was difficult enough with natural and man-made dangers, but the greed of those in power added another layer of hardship. Officials stationed at key checkpoints and borders often abused their authority, demanding bribes under the guise of taxes or inspections. Goods that were deemed valuable, silks, spices, or gems, were at risk of being confiscated outright with little to no justification. These acts of extortion were not random but widespread, creating a network of exploitation that siphoned wealth from merchants long before they could reach their destinations. For smaller traders, the burden was especially heavy. Unable to pay the inflated fees or bribes, many were forced to abandon their goods, close their businesses, or even fall into debt. Larger trade caravans might have had the resources to comply, but the added costs often meant raising prices, which ultimately strained economies along the route. What made this corruption even more insidious was its deeply entrenched nature. In many cases, bribes and confiscations were not the acts of isolated individuals but part of an organized system that funneled wealth to higher-ranking authorities, enriching the ruling classes in various regions. Attempts to resist this exploitation were met with the full force of power. Traders who objected or tried to bypass checkpoints often faced imprisonment, loss of their entire cargo, or violent retaliation. This cycle of greed not only disrupted trade but also eroded trust among merchants and officials, making the Silk Road's already precarious journey even more treacherous. With travelers constantly worried about what awaited them at the next checkpoint, the Silk Road became as much a path through fear as it was a bridge between cultures. Moving forward, the harsh deserts of the Silk Road posed challenges of an entirely different kind, presenting traders with an unforgiving and unpredictable environment where survival itself became the ultimate test. With the next phase of the journey in sight, we confront the unforgiving deserts that stretched across vast sections of the Silk Road. These arid landscapes were among the most treacherous challenges traders had to endure. The scorching heat of the day was so intense that it could blister the skin, while nighttime temperatures often dropped to freezing, creating a hostile and unpredictable environment. Sandstorms, sudden and relentless, could obscure the path within moments, causing caravans to lose their way and separate, leaving many stranded without hope of rescue. The fine desert sand penetrated everything: eyes, lungs, and even the tightly wrapped goods, adding to the miseries of those attempting to brave these barren expanses. Dehydration was perhaps the most lethal threat. With scarce water sources often located days apart, even the most prepared caravans risked running out of this precious resource. Travelers often had to ration water to survive, but for some, it was not enough. Stories of entire groups perishing after misjudging the distance to the next oasis were tragically common. Exhaustion, combined with the relentless mirages in the distance, played cruel tricks on the mind, luring desperate individuals further off course. Even the animals, the lifelines of these journeys, were not immune to the desert's wrath. Camels, prized for their ability to endure such harsh conditions, could still succumb to the unyielding heat or collapse from exhaustion, leaving traders stranded with no means of transport. The silence of the desert was deceptive, masking its dangers while amplifying the sense of isolation and dread. For those navigating these desolate routes, the desert was not just a physical obstacle but an unrelenting test of their endurance and will to survive. As the trials of the natural world pressed harder on travelers, cultural misunderstandings would later emerge as another silent threat, complicating interactions and inflaming tensions along this interconnected web of trade. As the next challenge unfolds, we encounter the complex interplay of diverse cultures along the Silk Road, a network that spanned continents and connected vastly different peoples. While this melting pot of languages, traditions, and beliefs often led to enriching exchanges, it also became a breeding ground for cultural misunderstandings. Picture a bustling caravanserai alive with merchants from distant lands, each speaking their own language and adhering to their unique customs. Misinterpretations were inevitable. A simple gesture or word in one culture could carry an entirely different, even offensive, meaning in another. These misunderstandings sometimes escalated from minor disagreements into full-blown conflicts. Distrust brewed when traders feared being cheated or when deals fell through due to differing norms and expectations. Such clashes were not only limited to individuals but could ripple out to entire communities. Tensions rose when local populations, wary of foreign influences, resisted the arrival of traders who they perceived as outsiders encroaching on their way of life. Suspicion ran high when unfamiliar goods or practices were introduced, often seen as a threat to local traditions. In some cases, these cultural divides fueled violence as rival groups struggled to assert dominance or retaliate against perceived slights. Even religious differences contributed to the friction, as travelers brought their faiths into regions with deeply rooted beliefs, sparking debates and at times hostility. These cultural misunderstandings added a layer of unpredictability and risk to an already perilous journey, forcing traders to navigate not just physical hazards, but also the delicate minefield of human interaction. As the threads of the Silk Road intertwined, they revealed the dual-edged nature of connection uniting worlds while also exposing the fragility of understanding. And yet, the challenges of human relationships were only one piece of the puzzle, as the realities of limited mobility for women along this route revealed yet another hidden disparity. With the next phase of the journey in sight, we uncover the stark reality of limited mobility for women along the Silk Road. This bustling trade network, filled with opportunity and peril, was largely a world dominated by men. Women, for the most part, were excluded from the inner workings of trade and commerce, confined instead to domestic roles or localized labor far from the caravans that crossed continents. Societies along the Silk Road often imposed strict social norms and expectations on women, restricting their movement and involvement in public life. These norms varied across regions but shared a common thread: women were rarely permitted to partake equally in the economic activities that defined the route's purpose. Even in cases where women participated, their roles were often exploitative. Some were forced into servitude, transported as commodities in the same caravans that carried silk, spices, and gold. Others found themselves in precarious positions as entertainers or courtesans, roles that were laden with risk and often subject to abuse, yet there were exceptions. In rare circumstances, women acted as traders, artisans, or healers, navigating societal barriers with remarkable resilience. Historical records tell of a few notable women who defied the odds, contributing to the silk trade or managing businesses in the absence of male family members. However, these instances were the exception, not the rule. For the vast majority, the Silk Road represented opportunity only through the lens of male ambition, overshadowing the contributions and sacrifices of women relegated to the margins. This imbalance underscores a deeper narrative of inequality woven into the fabric of this legendary trade route. As we reflect on these restrictions, it becomes evident that the Silk Road not only facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas, but also perpetuated long-standing social inequities. And while this limitation on women's mobility shaped the human dynamic of the Silk Road, another form of disparity manifested in the deceptive pursuit of wealth, where merchants risked everything for fortunes that could vanish in an instant. With the next phase of the journey in sight, we delve into the deceptive nature of wealth along the Silk Road, a mirage that lured countless merchants into risking everything they had. The promise of abundant riches drove traders to embark on perilous expeditions, often stretching their resources to the very brink. Investing in a caravan meant acquiring goods, hiring guards, securing pack animals, and navigating countless hazards along the way. A single misstep, a sandstorm in the desert, a bandit attack, or the loss of a prized cargo could erase years of savings in an instant. For many, wealth gained from successful trades was dazzling but fleeting. A caravan returning with rare silks or precious spices could amass a fortune, but merchants often found themselves reinvesting almost immediately, chasing another windfall and plunging deeper into the cycle of risk. Compounding this uncertainty were volatile markets where prices fluctuated wildly. Goods that were immensely valuable in one city could be worthless in another due to oversupply or shifting demand. This unpredictability transformed wealth into an elusive prize, always just out of reach or perilously temporary. Merchants also faced hidden costs: imperial taxes, bribes to corrupt officials, or losses incurred through counterfeit goods that further chipped away at their profits. The constant gamble of trading on the Silk Road revealed a system where wealth could vanish as quickly as it was earned. Yet, this relentless pursuit for riches drove the economic machine, with merchants willing to brave these risks, often out of necessity or ambition. While the shimmering allure of wealth kept the Silk Road alive, it also exposed the fragile reality of prosperity built on precarious foundations. And as merchants grappled with this volatility, another shadow loomed along the trade routes: the spread of counterfeit goods, which added yet another layer of mistrust to this intricate network of exchange. As the next shadow of the Silk Road comes into focus, we uncover the spread of counterfeit goods, a hidden menace that infiltrated the vibrant trade networks. Counterfeiters preyed on the allure of luxury goods, crafting fake silks, adulterated spices, and forged artifacts that deceived even the most discerning merchants. Imagine traveling for months, enduring scorching deserts or treacherous mountains, and finally arriving in a bustling marketplace only to discover that the fine silk you purchased was a cleverly disguised imitation, or the fragrant spices had been tainted with worthless fillers. These fraudulent practices not only cheated merchants and buyers out of their hard-earned wealth, but also eroded trust, the cornerstone of trade along the Silk Road. The fear of encountering fake merchandise made many traders hesitant to form new partnerships or venture into unfamiliar markets. Some merchants would go to great lengths to examine goods before purchasing, employing trusted middlemen or refusing to trade with regions notorious for counterfeits. And yet, even the most meticulous efforts couldn't guarantee security, as counterfeiters became increasingly sophisticated, mimicking the intricate weaves of Eastern silk or replicating the vibrant colors of precious dyes with remarkable precision. This proliferation of counterfeit goods added layers of suspicion and skepticism to an already precarious trading system. Honest merchants bore the brunt of this, as even legitimate products were subjected to intense scrutiny, slowing the pace of commerce and breeding resentment among trading partners. Yet, this challenge was not merely an economic one. It struck at the very heart of the Silk Road's promise: the exchange of authentic, high-quality goods that bridged cultures and civilizations. And as distrust seeped into the trade networks, it left merchants to grapple with an unsettling reality. Not everything that glittered was gold. From the deception of counterfeit goods, we now turn to another looming threat that shaped the Silk Road: the overdependence on trade, which brought both prosperity and peril to the towns and regions along its path. With the next phase of the journey in sight, we uncover the precarious reality of overdependence on Silk Road trade a double-edged sword that brought both fortune and fragility to towns and regions along its sprawling path. Many settlements thrived solely because of the bustling commerce, their economies intricately tied to the flow of goods, ideas, and wealth traveling along these routes. Markets teemed with exotic spices, fine silk, and precious metals, while inns, workshops, and caravanserais buzzed with constant activity. However, this prosperity came at a cost. When trade routes shifted due to political turmoil, natural disasters, or the rise and fall of empires, entire towns faced economic ruin. Imagine a once thriving oasis, its streets filled with the chatter of traders from distant lands, suddenly falling silent as caravans were routed to avoid conflict or pursue more favorable terrain. These communities, which had flourished from trade, often lacked the self-sufficiency to sustain themselves when the lifeline of commerce was severed. Without the steady influx of goods and traders, local economies withered, leaving ruins where vibrant trading hubs once stood. Even great cities were not immune. Regions that had poured resources into protecting and maintaining the Silk Road infrastructure found themselves grappling with economic collapse as their investments turned to dust when trade dried up. This overdependence not only destabilized individual settlements but also rippled across entire regions, creating a patchwork of abandoned towns and struggling outposts. The decline of trade left many to wrestle with a harsh truth. Reliance on a single source of prosperity, no matter how lucrative, carried immense risks. And as these settlements faded into the annals of history, they served as a stark reminder of how fragile the balance of wealth and survival could be along the Silk Road. As this tale of overdependence unfolds, another dimension of the Silk Road's impact comes into view: the unintended consequences it wrought on nomadic tribes, whose way of life was forever altered by the relentless expansion of trade routes. As the next challenge unfolds, we delve into the profound impact the Silk Road had on the nomadic tribes that once roamed freely across the vast steppe and desert landscapes. For centuries, these tribes thrived in harmony with their environments, their lives defined by migration, herding, and the preservation of deeply rooted cultural traditions. The expansion of the Silk Road, however, introduced a series of disruptions that would forever alter their way of life. As trade routes carved through their ancestral lands, grazing areas crucial for livestock dwindled, replaced by caravan paths and growing settlements. The delicate balance that nomads maintained with nature was upended, forcing many to adapt or abandon their traditional livelihoods. Beyond the loss of land, there was also the erosion of cultural identity. Contact with merchants from diverse regions brought both opportunities and challenges, as new goods and ideas began to infiltrate their societies. While some tribes embraced trade, many found their customs and traditions overshadowed or even suppressed by the dominant cultures that wielded power along the trade routes. The allure of wealth also caused divisions within communities, as some individuals sought to integrate into the burgeoning trading networks, leaving behind their nomadic heritage. These changes didn't just affect individual tribes but threatened the very existence of nomadic life as a cornerstone of certain regions. Over time, many tribes were pushed to the fringes, their voices and traditions fading into obscurity as commerce reshaped the landscapes they had called home for generations. The Silk Road's expansion was undoubtedly a marvel of human achievement, but for the nomadic tribes, it was a force of displacement and cultural upheaval, a reminder that progress often comes at a profound cost. As the echoes of their disrupted lives linger, we now turn to another shadowy consequence of this grand trade network: a closer look at how the relentless pursuit of wealth along the Silk Road fueled greed and conflict across the ancient world. Now turning to the spread of greed and conflict, the immense wealth generated by the Silk Road was not without its darker consequences. As caravans transported silks, spices, and precious goods across vast territories, the sheer value of these commodities became a magnet for avarice. Cities along the route, once thriving hubs of cultural exchange, often found themselves in fierce competition to dominate trade. This hunger for wealth drove some to impose exorbitant taxes on merchants, while others resorted to sabotage or even military aggression to secure their monopolies. Empires, too, were drawn into this web of envy and rivalry. The desire to control profitable segments of the Silk Road often led to wars, with powerful rulers dispatching armies to conquer key cities and trade hubs. Entire regions became battlegrounds, their populations caught between the ambitions of warring factions. Even within the merchant community, greed fostered betrayal and mistrust. Alliances between trading groups could dissolve overnight, replaced by fierce rivalries that saw sabotage, price manipulation, and even outright violence. This relentless pursuit of profit reshaped the political and economic landscapes of countless regions along the Silk Road, often leaving destruction in its wake. At its core, the Silk Road embodies humanity's ability to connect and create, but it also reveals the lengths to which individuals and nations will go in their quest for wealth and power. Having uncovered the greed-fueled struggles that marred this ancient trade network, we now shift our attention to another concealed reality: the secretive tactics traders employed to maintain their dominance, veiling the origins of their goods in an intricate web of mystery and misinformation. With the next phase of the journey in sight, we unravel the secretive nature of traders along the Silk Road, a world where deception was not just a tactic but a survival skill. Merchants fiercely guarded the origins of their goods, weaving elaborate stories to ensure their products were seen as rare and exotic. A bolt of silk might be passed off as originating from a distant, mysterious kingdom, even if it was produced just a few villages away. Spices were often claimed to come from lands perilously hard to reach, inflating their value in the eyes of buyers. This veil of secrecy served more than just profit. It maintained monopolies, as rival merchants were unable to trace supply lines or replicate the trade routes. Some traders even spread misinformation, describing treacherous paths or mythical dangers to deter others from venturing into their sourcing regions. Such tales of peril, combined with a lack of detailed maps, helped preserve monopolistic control over certain goods, allowing traders to dominate specific markets for years, even decades. Yet secrecy came with risks. The very myths merchants created could backfire, leading to distrust and wariness among their clientele. This constant balancing act between trust and deception was a hallmark of trading life on the Silk Road. As we peel back these layers of mystery, we see how misinformation wasn't merely a tool to gain wealth, but an essential strategy to navigate the cutthroat world of ancient commerce. Moving forward, we explore how the Silk Road's rise and fall intertwined with the fate of entire civilizations, leaving both growth and devastation in its wake. As the next chapter of this intricate tale unfolds, we explore the profound impact the Silk Road had on the rise and fall of civilizations. This network of trade was not merely a lifeline for commerce but a central artery through which the fate of empires flowed. At its height, the Silk Road nourished the Tang dynasty, turning it into one of the most powerful empires of its time. Thriving trade brought wealth, cultural exchange, and innovation, fueling an era of prosperity and influence that spanned continents. But this reliance was also its Achilles heel. The same routes that brought treasures and ideas also carried threats in the form of invasions and economic overdependence. As foreign armies sought to control these lucrative pathways, the Tang dynasty faced relentless pressures from external forces such as the Tibetan Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. Territorial disputes and the inability to safeguard critical trade links weakened their grip over time. Internally, the inflow of wealth created disparities that fostered corruption and rebellion, further destabilizing the empire. The story of the Tang dynasty is just one example. Across regions, entire civilizations rose to prominence by controlling trade on the Silk Road, only to falter when those very trade routes shifted or declined. New empires emerged, rerouting commerce and leaving former powerhouses to collapse under the weight of lost revenue. This pattern repeated itself with eerie regularity, showing how the Silk Road was both a bridge to greatness and a harbinger of decline. But the fallout of such collapses did not end with the empires themselves. It rippled across communities reliant on the trade network, leaving scars that lingered for generations. As we delve deeper, it becomes clear that the Silk Road was more than just a connector of worlds. It was a force capable of building and breaking the most formidable civilizations. Moving ahead, we reflect on the enduring legacy of exploitation and its echoes in modern global trade. As the next phase of the journey comes into focus, we confront the enduring legacy of exploitation tied to the Silk Road, a dark truth that continues to cast its shadow in today's global economy. The Silk Road, for all its historic significance, was also a stage where systemic inequities took root. The wealth it generated often came at the expense of the vulnerable laborers worked under brutal conditions. Communities were stripped of their resources, and societies were shaped by an imbalance that placed profit above people. These patterns, forged thousands of years ago, find unsettling echoes in modern global trade. Think of the sweatshops churning out textiles under grim conditions, the relentless extraction of natural resources from impoverished regions, and the exploitation of workers across industries who, much like their ancient counterparts, often toil invisibly to sustain a system that benefits only a select few. Just as the Silk Road concentrated wealth and power in certain hands while marginalizing others, today's trade networks perpetuate cycles of disparity. The products that now travel across continents, whether in shipping containers or digital transactions, carry with them the unseen stories of those who suffer in silence, much like the exploited laborers and enslaved people of the past. The parallels are striking, a reminder that while trade can unite and enrich societies, it can also deepen divides and perpetuate injustices when left unchecked. Reflecting on the Silk Road's legacy forces us to question the structures we uphold today. Are we truly learning from history, or are we repeating its darkest chapters in new guises? As we close this exploration of the Silk Road's hidden truths, it serves as a stark reminder of how deeply intertwined human progress and exploitation have been, and how essential it is to rewrite that narrative as we look toward the future. As we reach the conclusion of the Silk Road story, we're left with a mosaic of contrasts, grand achievements intertwined with darker, often unsettling realities. Beyond the romanticized tales of cultural exchange and prosperity lies a complex legacy riddled with exploitation, conflict, and suffering. From the relentless banditry and human trafficking to the spread of deadly diseases and the exploitation of both laborers and animals, each dark truth unraveled paints a picture of a network that thrived as much on human cost as on innovation. The Silk Road was a lifeline for empires and merchants, but it also served as a vessel for greed, environmental degradation, and inequity. Through this journey, we've witnessed how its influence extended beyond ancient times, leaving behind echoes that resonate in today's global trade systems. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that progress and prosperity often come at a price, and that this price is too frequently paid by the vulnerable. So the question remains, as we admire the achievements of the past, how do we ensure that we do not repeat its darkest chapters? Can we reshape the patterns of exploitation inherited from history, or are we doomed to perpetuate them in a new form? These are challenges we must face as we continue to trade, connect, and grow as a global society. Let the story of the Silk Road be more than a lesson about the past. Let it be a call to action for the future. If this exploration of hidden truth resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to join us in uncovering more of history's untold stories. Together, we can reflect, learn, and pave the way for a better tomorrow.